The final learning objective for this module is to list and briefly describe the 12 cranial nerves. The cranial nerves are 12 pairs of nerves that arise from the brain and brainstem, making up part of the peripheral nervous system. So each cranial nerve is identified with a number designated by Roman numerals and a name. The numbers indicate the order from anterior to posterior in which the nerves arise. The name designates the nerve's distribution or their function. 3 of the cranial nerves carry only sensory neurons and are called special sensory neurons because they're associated with our special senses of seeing, hearing, and smelling. These are the olfactory, optic, and vestibulocochlear nerves. 5 cranial nerves are classified as motor nerves because they contain only axons of motor neurons as they leave the brainstem. These neurons innervate skeletal muscles of the eyes and the tongue and include the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, the abducens nerve, the accessory nerve, and the hypoglossal nerve. The remaining 4 cranial nerves are called mixed nerves because they contain axons of both sensory and motor neurons entering and exiting the brainstem. These include the trigeminal, facial, glossopharyngeal, and the vagus nerves. Now, I'm not going to go through each cranial nerve in detail, but I did want to show you some of these nerves a little closer up. So cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. It is entirely sensory and contains the axons that conduct nerve impulses for olfaction or smell. We will cover this again when we get to the special senses in a few weeks, but the olfactory receptors for smell sit within this olfactory epithelium. This sits in the superior part of our nasal cavity. Odorants or smells will dissolve in the mucus in the nose. That then activates our receptors. The nerve impulse runs then along our olfactory bulb, the olfactory tract, which then makes up our olfactory nerve. Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve, which again we will come back to when we look at the special senses. And the optic nerve is another nerve which is entirely sensory, carrying our nerve impulses for vision. In the retina, so this is our retina here, which is the innermost layer of our eye, we have receptors for vision called photoreceptors. More specifically, these can either be rods or cones. These rods and cones are stimulated by light, which generates receptor potentials, which travels along our bipolar cells to our ganglion cells, which then converge to form our optic nerve. So you can see this is our optic nerve heading back to the brain there. The last of our special sensory nerves, which we'll come back to again, is our cranial nerve 8 and the vestibulocochlear nerve. So the vestibulocochlear nerve has 2 branches, a vestibular branch, which extends from the vestibule in the inner ear and carries our nerve impulses for equilibrium, and the cochlear branch, which extends from the cochlea and carries the nerve impulses for hearing. So this structure and these structures here are our vestibule. They make up our equilibrium receptors. This coiled structure here is our cochlea, which carries our nerve impulses for hearing. So these 2 branches then converge into our vestibulocochlear nerve. As an example of a purely motor nerve, here we have cranial nerve 11, which is our accessory nerve. And the accessory nerve conveys nerve impulses to the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscles. So these are muscles of the neck and the upper back or the shoulder region. Our sternocleidomastoid muscles here, and this is part of our trapezius here. These muscles help coordinate our head and our neck movements. Lastly, an example of a mixed nerve, so a nerve which contains both motor and sensory axons, is cranial nerve number 7, or the facial nerve. The sensory axons of the facial nerve extend from the taste buds of the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, so the front portion of the tongue, from the receptors for touch, pain, and thermal sensations from the skin in the ear canal, so the hole in your ear, and then also from proprioceptors in the muscles of the face and the scalp. Axons of the motor neurons innervate muscles of the inner ear, the face, the scalp, and the neck. And this allows for change in things like facial expression. It can also help dampen or soften the sound waves that are entering the ear in the case of really loud noises. Now, interestingly, the facial muscle actually innervates more skeletal muscle than any other nerve in the whole body. Now, just to be clear, I don't need you to be able to regurgitate the exact makeup and function of each of these 12 cranial nerves. However, I do want you to understand what makes a cranial nerve, to understand how they are numbered and named, and whether they are made up of a sensory neuron, a motor neuron, or both. Now, when some of you move on in your degrees, you'll need to understand in more detail the function of each of these cranial nerves. However, this is not something that I will test you on in this unit. That being said, I have put together this summary table of the cranial nerves. I'm not going to read it out to you, but you might like to make up something similar as part of your own revision. I also want to note that some of the cranial nerves have much more extensive functions than I've listed here. So this is just an example of some of those functions. But one tool that might help you remember some of the information that you could be tested on, and this is the stuff that I really do want you to remember, and that could be using the tool of a mnemonic. And a mnemonic is a memory aid or a learning technique that helps individuals remember information more easily. It can take the form of an acronym, it could be a rhyme, or it could be a sentence, where the first letter of each word in that sentence, as an example, corresponds to the first letter of the word that you're trying to remember. So if we take a look at this list here on the left, and we have the sentence on, they travelled and found Voldemort guarding very ancient Horcruxes. Now this sentence, obviously Harry Potter themed. I chose this sentence as it's one of the more PG versions I've come across, but the first letter of each of the words in the sentence corresponds to the first letter of the name of each of those cranial nerves in order. So we have on olfactory, on optic, on oculomotor, they trochlear, as an example. This second column, a little less PG, but something that's a bit silly and therefore easy to remember. And the first letter of each of the words in this sentence correspond to whether the cranial nerve is sensory, is motor, or is both, so a mixed nerve. So we have some say marry money, but my brother says big boobs matter more. So some sensory, say sensory, marry motor, but both.